Okay, hello English literature students. This is an overview of Goblin Market. If you are first years, this is to introduce you to it, to give you a sort of roadmap through the poem. If you're second years, this should help you revise and remember exactly what the key things are in this long narrative poem. Okay, so first thing is about form. Yep, that this is a narrative poem. There are other narrative poems in our selection. And here are some of the features of narrative poems that you should be able to talk about in Goblin Market, make notes on, and have an awareness of. So it has a complex plot, more complex than the other narrative poems we have, like Maud Clare or An Apple Gathering. It has a range of characters who are characterized. It has a number of settings. It has a narrator, a narrative voice. Time is managed in a variety of ways, including flashbacks. And there is a moral at the end. Okay, if you remember the word we sometimes use to describe some of Rossetti's poems, didactic, that idea that one of her purposes was to teach. Okay, so if you want to think about the plot and what you could say about the plot in a narrative poem, you can look at cause and effect. That's what drives narratives forward. If you think about lyric poems, they're about feelings and emotions, and they kind of wander through feelings and emotions. Narratives are driven forward by cause and effect. The goblins come, the goblins tempt. One of the girls is tempted and takes a bite. That makes her fall ill. Yep, these are cause and effect features. There's also a story within a story. If you remember, Lizzie warns Laura and says, "Do you remember what happened to Jeanie?" And we have a little flashback to what happened to Jeanie. Also, the plot has patterns and contrasts. The first rising action of the story is Laura's temptation and fall. And that's kind of takes us to the sort of midway point, or 2/3 of the way through. Then we have Lizzie's resistance and victory. Lizzie's resistance is sort of the climax, and then her victory at the end. We also have time passing. We have time markers in the poem, giving us an idea of days passing. Sometimes, this happened in the evening, this happens in the night, this happens the next morning. Other time is passing in much broader strokes of seasons passing. And the other way the plot is structured is physically in the journeys the girls take to and from the glen and the brook, from their cottage, across the moor, to the brook and back again. The main characters, the protagonists in the story, are the two sisters, Laura and Lizzie. They are living in domestic happiness. There is a contrast from the very beginning between Laura's curiosity and Lizzie's fear. But the poem also stresses how similar they are in appearance and affection for one another. And I'm sure that's also why Rossetti gives them names that start with the same letter. But on the whole, Lizzie is the one who warns and cautions Laura. That's part of her character. Lizzie wants to help, is brave, but also can resist temptation. There is similar imagery used of the two sisters, but there's also contrasting imagery, often about their physical appearance, but some also times about what their actions are. The antagonists in the poem are the goblins. The goblins are not contrasted with one another. They are very similar in character and behaviour, but they are differentiated in their appearance, and they are very excitingly described, sinisterly described as these sort of monstrous creatures. Their movements, their sounds, and their physical appearance compared to animals and birds. They are described with words such as queer, sly, and leering. Remember, the word queer in the 19th century does not have any of the connotations that it has nowadays, the modern connotations of homosexuality. The goblins can be very persuasive. Their voices are described cooing like doves, for example. But towards the end of the poem, we see their true characters. They become violent, and they're described outright as evil. And in a very sinister and spooky way, they disappear when they are defeated by Lizzie. The main key settings in the poem are Lizzie and Laura's house. It's not described in great detail. It's very folk tale in that respect, or like a ballad, in that you just get little details, and you just have to picture the whole scene. There's a wall, there's a gate, you have the sense it's a farmstead. They have to cross a heath, which is a very wild landscape. We get details such as crags, and we know what grows there are plants such as furze and heather. Both of these suggest a northern setting, which would fit in with the 19th century fashion for ballads from the north of England and the north of Britain, Scottish and northern ballads. Furze is actually, I think, a northern dialect word for gorse. And gorse is that yellow-flowered, spiny plant that grows on the moors. Heather is the low-growing, purple-flowered one. The word glen is itself a Scottish word, so we've got that connotation again. The glen is a mossy, winding valley, and through the glen winds the brook and its bank. And this is where the maidens from, we assume, the village or the settlement have to come to collect water. And Laura and Lizzie, in the beginning of the poem, hide amongst the rushes and peep through. And we get this very pretty description of the riverbank. May make us think of the pre-Raphaelite paintings, particularly the painting of Ophelia with all the detailed plant life along the riverbank. The poem is set in a distant fairy tale past, even to the 19th century authors. This is clearly a long, long time ago. If we have to give a historical period, we could say medieval, but it's not meant to be a historically accurate poem. It's that sort of far away and long ago past of fairy stories. Magic is possible and happens in this world. The girls have to go and collect water, and the characters, as far as we can tell, live by farming and livestock. The themes in the poem are of sisterly love, really, really strong love between the sisters. And this is a very 19th century phenomenon, very different, sadly, perhaps, from modern times. The way that women had to live, middle-class women, had to live in the home, does seem to have created extremely strong and affectionate sisterly bonds. And you see this in literature and in real life. So Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra, Charlotte Bronte and her two sisters Emily and Anne, they clearly were very loving, close sisters, Christina Rossetti and her sister. And in their fiction, they write about close sisterly bonds. And also in this poem, female virtue triumphs. A theme very common in Rossetti is the danger of temptation, especially to young, unmarried, virgin women, girls. But it demonstrates the power of virtue against evil, and also the possibility of a second chance for women who have fallen, and for women who have made the wrong decision, and for women who have given in to temptation. That is not the end. They can be rescued, and they can return to being virtuous and good. And also there's a sort of touch on what is women's place and role. Now, you don't, in the exam, have to talk much about different critical interpretations, but it's worth thinking about it. Obviously, the most clear view of this is it's a fairy tale, and we get sort of fairy tale moral and lessons. Good and bad are really clear, evil and virtue, which is typical of fairy tales, but it's almost impossible not to also see a symbolic meaning in the poem of sexual desire and temptation, when the goblins are offering their fruits, and when it's the maidens they offer it to, and when the maidens fall for it. There's also a quite graphic description of the goblin violence against Lizzie that also seems a bit like sexual violence. When we come to that, we'll talk about that. The poem clearly has a religious significance. Good Lizzie sacrifices herself to save fallen Laura, and almost takes on a sort of Christ-like role. The good, wholly good person dying to save the one who's fallen, and literally offering herself to be consumed like bread and wine in a communion service. There's also, some people see a reference to the sort of addictions and illnesses that Victorian society suffered from. In particular, there was the scourge of opium addiction in the form of laudanum. And the description of Laura once she's become addicted to the fruit and can't have any more, it does seem to be quite a realistic or believable depiction of someone in the grips of addiction. And also the depiction of Lizzie caring for her is very typical of what lots of Victorian women had to do. It was one of their domestic roles in the home. If someone was ill, they were the nurses in the bedchamber.